Okay, let's go real quickly over Second Kings chapter 1. Second Kings chapter 1 deals with Ahaziah, king of Israel. Now, there is another Ahaziah who is king of Judah, but we're not concerned about him at the moment. We're concerned about Ahaziah, king of Israel. Some of these kings have the same name as their counterparts in the other kingdoms, so it can be confusing. But let's focus Ahaziah, king Israel. Now, Ahaziah has had an accident. He's a little bit beat up, and he's wondering if he's going to survive the accident. So he sends men to go and inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron. And while he has sent his men out to go inquire of a false god, they're intercepted by Elijah. And Elijah says, "What is this? Isn't there a God in Israel that you could inquire of? Because you've chosen to inquire, because the king has chosen to inquire of a false God, he is not going to recover, he's going to die." And so the men that Ahaziah had sent out return, and Ahaziah is surprised that they're back so soon. And he says, "What happened that you're back early?" And they said, "A prophet confronted us and told us that you were going to die." And he said, "Well, who was it?" And they described him, and Ahaziah recognizes that this is Elijah. And so Ahaziah sends a group of 50 men to go arrest Elijah. The first 50 attempt to arrest him forcibly. Elijah calls for fire from heaven, and the 50 men are incinerated. The second group, a second group goes with the same purpose, the same intention, and the same results. And then finally, a third group goes, and the commander of the third group, knowing what happened to the first two groups, is a little more humble. And when he comes up to Elijah, he says, "Will you please come with us back to King Ahaziah? Please, spare my life, spare the life of my men." He does. And so Elijah comes down from the hill and heads back with these men and simply tells Ahaziah that because you have attempted to consult with a false god and have not consulted with the true God of Israel, you are going to die. And this is the pretty much the last story that we have of Elijah the prophet. There's one more coming up in chapter 2. Now we come to 2 Kings 2, and we're dealing with Elijah and Elisha. Now we're about to say goodbye to Elijah. He is going to be supernaturally carried up into heaven, and he is going to avoid death. He is the only man in the Bible other than Enoch who does not die a natural death, but is in a supernatural way removed from the earth. Now Elijah and Elisha are walking together towards the Jordan River, and 3 times Elijah asks Elisha to remain behind, and each time Elisha says, "No, I'm going to follow you." And so the 2 men come to the Jordan River, and Elijah takes off a cloak, a mantle. It's an outer garment to protect you from the weather. And he takes that and he strikes the Jordan River with it. The Jordan River parts, and the 2 men go across together. Interestingly, they go across at the same place that Joshua had come across going the other way with the nation of Israel when they came into the land of Canaan to conquer and to subdue it in the first place centuries earlier. So Elijah and Elisha are crossing at the same point, but going in the opposite direction. They're heading eastward. And once on the other side of the Jordan River, Elijah asks Elisha, "What do you want?" And Elisha says, "I want a double portion of your spirit." And so Elijah says that essentially that will happen under certain circumstances. And at that moment, chariots of fire drawn by horses of fire descend to take up Elijah rather, and carry him up into heaven. What remains of Elijah is that mantle. And that falls to the ground, and Elisha takes up that mantle. And this is an expression that comes down to us over many centuries. The taking up of the mantle is a saying meaning taking up a role of leadership. And now Elisha has taken up the role of leadership. He has taken up the mantle, the cloak of Elijah, and is now effectively taking the place of Elijah as the senior prophet. We're going to skip ahead to 1 Kings chapter 4, and there's some events in this chapter that are similar. Things that happen with Elisha are similar to things that had happened earlier with Elijah. Now, what happens here is that Elisha in the first chapter comes across a widower who has run out of money, and she is in debt, and the only thing she has to pay that debt is her two sons. And if she can't pay up the money, her sons are taken from her, sold into slavery, and she'll probably never see them again. And so she's in a pretty desperate situation when Elisha tells her, do this. I want you to get as many jars as you can. Go to your neighbors, go everywhere, and get every kind of containing vessel you can find and fill them with oil. And there is she has with her a jar of oil, and with that jar of oil, similarly to the jar of flour with the woman whom Elijah had met, this woman has this jar of oil with Elisha, and she fills one jar one after another until they're all full, and then Elisha says to her, now go sell that oil, and it's enough to pay the creditors. Now, Elisha moves on, and he encounters a Shunammite woman. We don't know her name, but we know she was wealthy. And she talked to her husband and said, this prophet, he comes through here every now and then, so let's build a room in our house where Elisha can stay while he's ministering and making his rounds. And the husband agrees, so I guess they go to the equivalent of Home Depot, get the lumber they need, build the extra add-on room to the house. And so while Elisha is staying there, he informs the woman that you will have a child. Now she laughs because she's old, but this has happened before in Scripture, hasn't it? When people have had, and actually it will happen later in Scripture, when people will have children under unusual circumstances. So the woman, though she's skeptical, she does have a child. And then, sadly, as this child grows up and becomes a few years older, he has some significant head pain, not sure what that means, a brain hemorrhage, a tumor, or something like that. But he shouts, my head, and this poor kid dies. And so the Shunammite woman is distressed. She is angry. She is resentful. She is, and it's understandable why she would be that way. But the boy is brought to Elisha, and in a very similar way to the way that Elijah brought back the child. In his circumstance, Elisha likewise brings this child back to life, and he is restored to the Shunammite woman. And that brings us to the next chapter, chapter 5. Shall we move on to chapter 5 of 2 Kings? Now, chapter 5 of 2 Kings, the characters here that we're most concerned with are Naaman. Naaman is a Syrian, and he is a commander of the Syrian army, and he is a pretty manly man, and one that is respected and loved by his men. And we also have Elisha, whom you already know about, and Elisha has a servant named Gehazi, and he also figures into this event. What happens is Naaman has contracted leprosy, and so that's bad news anywhere you are in the Middle East. not entirely sure what this leprosy looked like, but it was a skin disease, and it simply meant that you had to isolate yourself from others. Hmm. Anyway, but this was a skin disease, not COVID-19, and so the coming down with this disease was a dreadful thing for Naaman. And Naaman has working for him an Israelite slave girl. And it seems that Naaman must have been a good master, because this girl seems to have some affection for Naaman, and she is concerned about his leprosy. And she says, you know, there's a prophet in my home country of Israel who can cure you of this leprosy. So word gets to Naaman, and the king of Syria, Ben-Hadad, writes a letter to the king of Israel and says, I'm sending along the commander of my army, Naaman, and I want you to cure him of his leprosy. Well, the king of Israel is terrified at this prospect, but nevertheless, he allows for Naaman to come, not that he has much choice in the matter anyway. And so Naaman is before the house of Elisha. Now here's Naaman, powerful, respected, a man who's used to giving orders and having them obeyed, and Elisha won't even come out to meet him. In fact, Elisha sends out his servant Gehazi, and Gehazi comes up to Naaman and says, well, my master says you need to wash yourself off in the Jordan River 7 times. Naaman is infuriated because he thought he would at least have an audience with the prophet Elisha. He thought that he would have been cured immediately of his leprosy. And then he starts bad-mouthing the Jordan River, saying, oh, there are rivers back where I come from. They're far more beautiful than your sorry Jordan River. That's it. I'm through. I'm going back home. Well, Naaman's men stop him and they say, listen, if he had asked you to do something extraordinary, you would have done it, right? Yeah. And they say, well, he's just asking you to jump in the Jordan River 7 times. What's the big deal? So Naaman says, oh, okay, I'll do it. So Naaman goes and jumps in the Jordan River 7 times and comes out with his skin healed. And so he wants to give a gift to Elisha, and Elisha says, sorry, not taking it. And he says, oh, please, take this gift. You've done me such a great favor. And Elisha says, no, I'm not going to. There's a little more to the exchange that takes place, and much to be learned from that exchange, but we have a lot to get through, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. Naaman returns home, healed. And on his way, Gehazi, Elisha's servant, realizes, you know what? He has a lot of stuff with him. He's got a lot of riches and wealth with him. And so Gehazi chases down Naaman and says, oh, hey, after you left, 2 prophets showed up, and my master would like a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothes for these 2 men that visited him. He was lying through his teeth. And so Naaman says, well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you 2 talents of silver and I'll give you 2 changes of clothing. And so Gehazi takes them and hides them. It's interesting. He's got these articles of wealth, but he can't enjoy them because he's gotten them dishonestly, and there's almost nothing he can do with them without being found out by Elijah. Well, he's found out anyway because, I'm sorry, I meant to say Elisha. He's found out anyway simply because God has gifted Elisha with this ability to just pretty much know everything that's going on. And so when Elisha confronts him, Gehazi initially denies it, and then Elisha says, well, the leprosy that clung to Naaman is now going to cling to you. And poor Gehazi, trying to retrieve the wealth of Naaman, ends up receiving the leprosy of Naaman instead, along with riches that he cannot enjoy. So there's, I think, a lot of moral direction in that story. Alrighty, more to come. Stay tuned. No, we're not through with the king of Syria yet, and actually, we won't be for a little while yet. But the king of Syria has a problem, and that is every time he makes battle plans against Israel, they get compromised. Somebody finds out about them and tips off the Israelites. And so Ben Hadad is, if this is in fact Ben Hadad, the Syrian king anyway, is angry with his staff, and he says to them, "Okay, which one of you is on the side of Israel? Which one of you is going ahead and divulging all this secret information?" And one of them says, "Well, there's a prophet in Israel, and he hears everything you speak, even the words in your bedchamber." Now, that's a pretty horrifying thought. And so the king simply says, "Capture him." And so a number of soldiers are dispatched to the city of Dothan, to not Dothan, Alabama. This is the other Dothan, and their goal is to capture the the prophet Elisha. Now, Elisha has a servant, very likely Gehazi. He's not mentioned by name in this chapter. But the servant gets up one morning and he sees this host of the Syrian army around him, and he's panicked. And Elisha simply says, "Oh, don't worry. There are more people with us than with them." And the servant said, "What are you talking about?" So Elisha prays, "Open his eyes, Lord." And when the servant's eyes are opened, he gets a glimpse into the spiritual realm, which few people ever get to see so clearly. And he sees a host of God's angels around the Syrian army and realizes they can do nothing apart from God's will. And so what happens shortly after this, the Syrian army is blinded, and then they are led to the king of Israel. And once they are led helpless to the king of Israel, the king of Israel says to Elisha, "Well, what should I do? Shall I smite them? Shall I kill them?" And Elisha says, "You'll do nothing of the sort. These are your prisoners. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to feed them, and you're going to give them something to drink." And so the king of Israel throws a feast for them, and these men return home astonished that they're alive, astonished at the events that have taken place, but they do return, and this is the almost the last we'll hear of the Syrians raiding into Israel until the next chapter. Now we're at an event that spans chapter 6 and goes on into chapter 7. So this is from the last part of 6 and into chapter 7. And that is that the city of Samaria, Samaria is the capital city of Israel, is under siege by the Syrians. And siege conditions have ensued, and it is bad. What happens is the food begins to run out, water begins to run out, and people resort to unthinkable things to stave off their hunger, to try to do something about their thirst, and just utterly disgusting things suddenly start looking good, in that degree of desperation that comes about from a food shortage, from a shortage of clean water, and so on. And the king of Israel is horrified to discover that two women have made a covenant with one another. The starvation has gotten so bad that they have agreed to eat the child of one day and eat the child of the other day. And so they follow through, and these two women agree, and one child is served up and eaten. Cannibalism is what's happening. And then the next day, the other woman has hidden her child and doesn't follow through with her part of this hideous deal. The king is outraged and instantly blames Elisha and says, you know, "Today I am going to remove Elisha's head from his shoulders." That actually doesn't happen, but what does happen is Elisha gives a prophecy that everything in the city that is being sold for food and so on. And of course, there's tremendous inflation. If you have a crumb of bread, you can get a lot of money for it because there just simply isn't good edible food in the city. And so things that would normally be thrown away are going for large sums of money. And Elisha is saying all of that's going to come down to its normal price level tomorrow. And the king has an assistant, and he says, oh, if the Lord opened up the windows of heaven, that wouldn't happen. And so Elisha says, well, you're going to see it, but you're not going to partake of it. And then something bizarre happens. Something causes the army of Syria to abandon their camp in a panic, and they leave everything behind. The only people who know about it are some people with leprosy. Here we have another story dealing with lepers. And there's a group of these guys outside of the city walls of Samaria, and they're looking at each other and they're saying, well, we're going to starve to death, or the Syrians will execute us. Why don't we, or maybe they'll be kind to us, so why don't we go to the Syrian camp and see what's happening? And so they walk into the Syrian camp with the intention of surrendering. And they not only find that there are no Syrians to surrender to, but they also discover that the Syrians have abandoned their camp, they've abandoned their food supplies, they've abandoned all of their water and wine supplies as well. And so the lepers are pillaging the camp. They're just really delighted. It's just like a field day. And so they're taking up stuff that they want, things of value, stuffing themselves. And then they look at each other and they say, you know, what we're doing is wrong. We need to tell the people back inside the city. And so they do. And so what happens is the king is skeptical. He's afraid that the Syrians have withdrawn and that they've set a trap, and that once the Israelites come out, they'll be ambushed and massacred. It's possible. It's actually a very, very likely possibility. So he's being cautious, and I think rightly so at this point. So he sends out some men to check it out. And they go riding on one or two of the only healthy horses that are left inside of Samaria. And they find that the camp really has been abandoned. And further on, they find evidence of discarded body armor. And so they realize these Syrians have fled, and they have fled in a hurry, and they really did leave all this stuff behind. And so what happens is there is a stampede out of the city to get something to eat. And the king's assistant sees the abundance of the Syrian army camp, but he doesn't live to partake of it because he gets trampled in the stampede. And that's the slightly bizarre but interesting and somewhat sad ending to chapter 7. More to come. Okay, let's go to 2 Kings chapter 9. Now, in 2 Kings chapter 9, we have three people that we're principally interested in. And I know the names can be confusing to keep up with, but let's just stay focused on who's who in this chapter. First of all, we have Elisha. We already know about him. He's sort of a secondary character here. But our first big character that we're concerned about is Jehu. We're going to be hearing a little bit more about him in the next few chapters. And along with Jehu, we have Joram, king of Israel, and we have Ahaziah, king of Judah. Now, we did have Ahaziah, king of Israel, back in chapter 1. He's passed away. He's deceased. He's no more. Now, we're dealing not with Ahaziah, king of Israel, but Ahaziah, king of Judah. So here we go. Jehu, who's soon to be king, Joram, king of Israel, Ahaziah, king of Judah. And Ahaziah and Joram are on friendly terms with each other at this point. So as we go into this story, Elisha sends a prophet to go anoint Jehu as the next king. And so Jehu is having a meeting with his officers. Jehu, by the way, is a military commander. And it's interrupted when this prophet comes in, just urgent, and says, where is Jehu? And they, oh, I'm Jehu. It says, I've got to talk to you. I've got to talk to you. Come on, out, out, out. Come on, let's talk. And so Jehu's like, well, okay, let's see what this is about. And then the prophet pours oil on Jehu's head, which is the way he is being marked as king, not with a crown on the head, but with a pouring of oil on the head. And he says, you are the king of Israel, and you are God's instrument of vengeance against the house of Ahab. And so he leaves. And then Jehu goes back to his officers, and they say, what was that about? What was this crazy nut doing? You know, they're a little taken aback at his abruptness and his urgency. And Jehu says, don't worry about it. And they say, no, tell us what happened. And Jehu says, well, okay, I just got anointed as the next king of Israel. And they go, whoa, yay. And so then they start celebrating long live Jehu, king of Israel. Well, now, Jehu has some work cut out for him because he's got a pretty heavy and a somewhat gruesome task ahead of him, and that is to eliminate the house of Ahab for their idolatry, for their sin, for their persistence in their sin, their failure to repent, and so on. And so what happens is in the city of Jezreel, Joram, king of Israel, is recovering from some wounds that he'd received in battle. And Ahaziah, king of Judah, has come to visit with him. So the two kings are on friendly terms. And somebody announces that, hey, somebody driving crazy fast is approaching. And so Joram gets into his chariot and goes out to meet who's this guy driving his chariot so fast towards the city of Jezreel? Well, it's Jehu. And so Joram is a little, I guess, concerned about Jehu's urgency. And he says, is it peace, Jehu? Are you coming on peaceful terms? And Jehu says, how can there be peace when your mother Jezebel is still in the land and leading Israel in her idolatry and in her worshiping of false gods and so on? And so Jehu makes it clear that no, he is not there on terms of peace. Joram becomes alarmed, turns his chariot around and shouts, Ahaziah, it's treason, it's treason. He doesn't say much more because Jehu draws his bow and pegs Joram right between the shoulder blades, and that's the end of Joram. And then Ahaziah gets in his chariot and tries to make a run for it. And then Ahaziah is captured by Jehu's men and is killed. And this is the beginning of Joram's cleaning up, Jehu's cleaning up of the house of Ahab. Okay, we're going to summarize some of the events in chapter 9 and some of the events in chapter 10. And what happens at the end of chapter 9 is that Jehu comes into the city of Jezreel, and there he meets the infamous Jezebel, the woman who led 400 prophets of Baal, the woman who dominated her husband Ahab, and the one who set up the death of the innocent Naboth, and the woman who sought to kill the prophet Elijah. And so she probably realizes that her death is imminent, and she puts on her best clothing and puts on her best makeup and sits in the city window and has a brief conversation with Jehu when he comes into the city of Jezreel. And so Jehu shouts out, who is on the Lord's side? And some people stick their heads out of their windows, and he says, cast her down. And so Jezebel is pushed out of her window, and she lands with a pretty substantial splat, and is left dead in the city street. So Jehu leaves that scene for a time, and then after a little bit he says, you know what, she was a king's daughter, make sure she gets a decent burial. But the people go out to find that there's not much left of Jezebel. The dogs have eaten most of her, and there's only a few things remaining left lying in the street, because it was prophesied that whoever dies of Ahab in the city shall become basically dog food, which is just a disgraceful and a horrifying way to go, especially for that time. Now, Jehu still has some work to do, and he tells the men of Jezreel, all right, you have 70 sons of Ahab in the city. And I'm sorry, this is the city of Samaria. Let me get my geography right. So Jehu goes not, he's left Jezreel. That's where he got rid of Jezebel. Now he's outside of Samaria, and which is the capital city of Israel. And he says, there are 70 sons of Ahab there. Stand and fight for them. And the men of the city of Samaria said, well, he just killed 2 kings, and he's fairly powerful. There's not much we can do. And so they try to compromise with Jehu, and they say, well, listen, we're your servants, we'll do what you want. And he says, find the 70 sons of Ahab and execute them. And so they do. And so Jehu says, bring their heads and bring them outside and put them in 2 heaps outside the city gate. Times were rough back then, in case you haven't picked up on that already. And so the 70 sons of Ahab have been put to death. And then Jehu has a little bit more to do, and that is he has to deal with the Baal prophets. And so he gathers he makes a public announcement in the city of Samaria, and he says, Ahab served Baal a little bit. I will serve him much. And so he orders a meeting of all the prophets of Baal. And all the prophets of Baal are gathered into one place. And Jehu has about 80 men outside with swords waiting for the order to clean up. And so Jehu says, now we're going to have this big feast to Baal, but first look around, make sure there are no worshipers of the Lord in this building. And so they look around, and so they assure Jehu that all the people there are Baal worshipers and Baal worshipers only. Then Jehu gives the order, and 80 armed men come in, and they kill every last one of the servants of Baal. And at this point, even though, as we're looking here at the year 2020, looking back on this and thinking, why this judgment? Why this to this degree? And maybe it's because we don't understand the degree to which sin is offensive to God, and sin calls for the judgment of God at any time and at any age, and that when God withholds judgment, that is a more amazing thing than his dispensing judgment. So Jehu has done his job. He has eliminated the house of Ahab. He has eliminated the Baal prophets. But he can't stay away from idolatry himself. And so Jehu lapses into the worship of the golden calves that had been set up by Jeroboam when the kingdoms of Israel and Judah had originally split. So Jehu has the possibility of maybe becoming the one decent king of Israel, and he blows it. And that's the end of Jehu. Okay, for chapter 11, here's who you need to know. Athaliah. And who is Athaliah? She is the one queen of Judah, and she's an illegitimate queen of Judah. And then we have Jehoiada, the priest, and then we have Jehoash, who is going to be the next king of Israel, of Judah. And Athaliah realizes that Ahaziah, her son, is dead. Remember, Jehu has killed Ahaziah. And so who is Athaliah? Well, she's the mother of Ahaziah. She is also the daughter of Ahab. And so the wickedness of Ahab and Jezebel pretty well runs in her veins. And Athaliah sees that her son is dead, and she realizes, well, she has a chance to be the ruler of Israel. So she exterminates, as she thinks, all of the legitimate claimants to the throne of Judah. She simply has all of her political rivals murdered, so that she can become queen of Judah. Except that what happens is one boy, Jehoash, as an infant, is taken away and is secretly hidden and cared for. Now, when Jehoash is still a boy, the priest Jehoiada sets up a coup, and he orders some men to be armed and to be ready. And what happens is it's a little complex in the workings out of it, but Jehoiada simply has a large number of armed men announce that Jehoash, who is alive after all, is actually going to be the next king of Judah. And so when Athaliah hears all the hoopla about a king being anointed of Judah, she shouts treason, a little ironic coming from her. And Jehoiada gives the order, and Athaliah is run down, and she is killed. And so she's no more. And now Jehoash is going to become king of Judah. Well, okay, here we go, chapter 17. And this is the end of the kingdom of Israel. Sennacherib, king of Syria, has come down to invade the nation of Israel. We're going to hear a good bit more about Sennacherib a little bit later on. But right now, we have the fall of the kingdom of Israel and the deportation of Israel, and they will be lost to history. So a number of things go on here. Hosea is the last king of Israel, and it's during his reign that the capital city of Israel, Samaria, is captured and is taken over by Sennacherib. And we have the reasons given to us here. Why did this judgment fall upon Israel? For this reason. In 2 Kings 17, we read in verse 7, "And this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods, and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced. And the people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. They built for themselves high places in all their towns, that is, high places for worship of false gods. From watchtower to fortified city, they set up for themselves pillars and asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. And there they made offerings on all the high places, as the nations did, whom the Lord carried away before them. And they did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger, and they served idols, of which the Lord had said to them, "You shall not do this." And remember that often this worship involved infant sacrifice. That was actually part of the worship of some of these Canaanite idols. Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, "Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with all the law that I commanded your fathers, and that I sent you by my servants the prophets." But they would not listen. They were stubborn, as their fathers had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. They despised his statutes, or held them to be of no value, and his covenant that he made with their fathers, and the warnings that he gave them. They went after false idols and became false. And they followed the nations that were around them, concerning whom the Lord had commanded them that they should not do like them. So that was the end of the nation of Israel. And an important thing to remember here is that in ancient conquests, when you conquer a large group of people, You uproot them and you deport them, and you bring somebody else that you have conquered into their land. And the advantages are several. When you uproot and deport a people, they begin to learn that their primary concern is no longer rebellion. Their primary concern is survival. And their children grow up in your culture. They will adopt the names of your culture, the names of your gods. They will speak the language of your culture, and they will become more and more like you than like their parents. So these are among the reasons that these mass deportations were carried out by ancient monarchs. Well, Israelites out, Samaritans in. So what happens is a number of foreigners are gathered from other conquered areas of the Assyrian Empire and moved into the region around Samaria. And they, of course, become the Samaritans. And they eventually have a blend of some sense of the worship of the true God and some sense of the worship of false gods as well. And so these are the Samaritans who will be in the land when the people of Judah return, and they will never be fully accepted by the people of Judah. So this is an amazing thing when Jesus meets with a Samaritan woman and ministers the gospel to her, or when Jesus tells to his fellow Jews the story of the Good Samaritan. That has some real shock value. So that's how the Samaritans got there. And this is when and how they got there. And this is, like I said, this is the end of the kingdom of Israel. Judah will be deported. Judah will return. Israel is done for.